Welcome back to The Overlook. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and in today's episode, we're going to continue to follow this story that I've talked about in the abstract and then more explicitly last week about Qatar and their lobbying of Washington, D.C., which includes major think tanks, both legacy and new media, which is what we're going to focus on today, and our politicians on both the left and the right side of the aisle. Now, if you've followed my conversation about the rise of the woke right at all the last year and a half, you've probably heard me talking about the prevailing talking points of Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, which were fringe about a year and a half ago, but have moved quite mainstream and being puppeted by Joe Rogan, Dave Smith, Theo and others in the Manosphere space, or people who traditionally call themselves free thinkers. So they might not align with a particular political party, but they've adopted the talking points of Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, who really spearheaded this neo-isolationist movement, which has direct ties to being anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, and also inherently anti the West, which is a lot less apparent if you listen to them talk. But if you look closely, especially at videos such as the interview Tucker Carlson did with Daryl Cooper, what you'll see is an insinuation that, first off, the Zionists puppeted and initiated World War II, this great evil, through Winston Churchill, who Daryl Cooper directly claims was bought off by the Zionists and initiated the war, which is historical. The war started and was initiated by Hitler and the Nazis when they invaded Poland and then continued to invade Czechoslovakia and other parts of Central Europe before Winston Churchill was ever prime minister and before he took office. And aside from that, the claim that Winston Churchill initiated or escalated World War II fails to look at the very robust evidence we have of Nazi ideology, their policies, and their agenda to create Lebensraum, living space for the Germans moving eastward throughout all of Europe. So Daryl Cooper, being an apologist for the Nazis, went on Tucker Carlson, and they basically put forth this idea that it was actually the West and Winston Churchill who are the evil agitators of the most horrific war in human history, and that it's actually the Nazis who are villainized and propagated by the Zionists to be the greatest evil of all time. Now, this disgusting narrative has become mainstream. People look for the Jews in absolutely every catastrophe. Hollywood, run by the Jews. Pedophilia in Hollywood, it's the Jews. Washington, D.C. is run by the Jewish cabal and Zionists, which is why we fund Israel and we have an alliance with Israel. Big Pharma, owned by the Jews. Legacy media, the Jews. Everything is the Jews, including, according to the woke right, Pornhub was created by the Jews. So this prevailing narrative has become culturally acceptable. And it's nothing new. These tropes are actually a return to pre-Holocaust tropes that were extremely prevalent throughout medieval to modern society in pre-war Europe. So this isn't revolutionary. These ideas are presented by someone like Candace Owens as like a free thinker pulling back the veil of our corrupt government to tell you the secret truths of what's actually happening. But none of what she's put forth is like a new conspiracy. Blood libels have been told since the Middle Ages. So it's actually a return to rhetoric and language before the Holocaust, which again, the Holocaust being this precedent and this example of what that ideology, what the Jewish conspiracy, if widely accepted, can lead to a catastrophe such as the Holocaust, even in civilized society amidst civilized Europe during World War II. Okay, so it brings us to today. For the longest time, I couldn't understand why someone like Tucker Carlson, for example, who is a seasoned journalist, who is well-educated, who was on legacy media and had a Fox News network primetime show, would then go to Russia and essentially be an apologist for Putin, provide him very, very softball questions. And what initially alarmed me to this shift on the right in the United States was Tucker Carlson's video in a Russian grocery store. Inflation was hitting Americans, and he goes to Russia and he essentially says, look at all these groceries. He brings his videography crew. he says all of these groceries in the United States, when we bought them last week, was $400. And here in Russia, it cost us only $100. And he says something to the effect of, and I'm not being hyperbolic, I'm summarizing or synthesizing, what he saw in Russia and at that grocery store had radicalized him against the corruption of his own government. Now, in that video, Tucker Carlson, a seasoned and highly intellectual and academically achieved man, failed to tell his audience about price adjustments, about the fact that the ruble is worth like 11 cents to the US dollar, that the median household income in Russia is significantly lower, that Russians don't have the same freedom of movement, the same education opportunities as afforded in America, that the American dream of climbing any corporate ladder is not easily accessible to those living in Russia under authoritarianism. No, he just went to Russia, used his American dollars, which are extremely strong in Russia, to buy a bunch of groceries, and then present it as a look how amazing Russia is and how corrupt the US government is. And it was at that very moment I questioned who the heck was buying off Tucker Carlson's interest. Because to claim this like anti-elitist agenda on his new platform, on his independent YouTube, and talk about the corruption of our US government, the swamp, using COVID as an example, which was really the catalyst for Tucker Carlson leaving Fox News, and then to go to an authoritarian regime and become an apologist for authoritarianism and present it as better than America, all while claiming to be a red-blooded American, a true conservative Christian, didn't make sense to me. Those two realities are in contradiction of each other. And then we started to see, well, America's actually bad for what they did in the Middle East and in Iraq. And is the Holocaust actually that bad? Or have we just been told it's that bad by the Jews? And do the Jews control our government? Yes, according to Tucker Carlson and then Candace Owens, who parroted this, it's AIPAC that controls our government. And then Candace Owens ran with that and said it's AIPAC that allows Israel, who she claims is the only foreign country that can lobby American representatives, which is false. And this just has snowballed into now what is a culturally accepted position on Israel and on the Jews. So specifically in the war in Israel between Israel and Hamas, a jihadist terrorist organization in Gaza who initiated the war on October 7th, that is looked to as an example of corruption in America and of Jewish control of American politics. Forget the fact that the United States and Israel have intrinsically linked security interest in the region, or the fact that Israel is the only democratic country in the Middle East where Christians and Jews and Muslims can thrive and worship their religions respectively and alongside each other. It's the only example of pluralism in the region. And yet, none of those reasons might explain the long-lasting US-Israel relationship. It has to be because of the corrupt Jews and because of AIPAC, which leads us to today. Okay, so I long suspected that there was some sort of lobbying happening because I couldn't understand why Tucker Carlson would turn like this and would be peddling just as anti-American rhetoric, and why Candace Owens, and I don't have any significant proof that either of these individuals are being lobbied by a country, let's say like Qatar or Russia. But again, they parrot and they put forth very similar ideas, almost in lockstep, in the way that the legacy media and the left agenda has done for the better half of a decade. And so seeing that pattern emerge now on the woke right and in the new media space leads me to believe that there's an organizing power or an overarching interest that is motivating and constructing the arguments that prominent woke right or new media personalities such as Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens are peddling. It's very uniform for a very decentralized new media frontier. Okay. I use Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens as this example because they were really the first people who were just asking questions about the Jews. And then they had the Daryl Coopers on, and then they were just asking questions about how bad the Nazis were during World War II. And then Candace Owens took that and she said that, because neo-Marxists run our education system in America and because neo-Marxists and Marxists are Jews, the Jews have lied that the Holocaust was a unique evil. She put forth the idea that there was a genocide of 12 million German Christians. Again, Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens love to insert their Christianity and have selective moral outrage from that standpoint, and conflating terms such as genocide with the unfortunate reality of total warfare in urban spaces and urban warfare, or the fact that the Nazis also bombed the living daylights out of London and the Blitz that were happening there and the civilian targets in the UK. And so this intellectually dishonest read of history and of foreign policy seems all too convenient for interests such as Qatar. And there was a controversy that happened probably about a year ago now with Lauren Chen, who parroted the AIPAC narrative, who was outraged that Candace Owens was fired by the Daily Wire, the Jews, for speaking out against the Jews. She was really putting that narrative forth. And Lauren Chen's channel, which was funded by The Blaze, was taken down. And she had been linked to a Russian propaganda company. And her role was essentially to peddle anti-America, pro-authoritarian rhetoric, anti-Jewish rhetoric. And she collaborated with other key conservative influencers such as Benny Johnson and Dave Rubin. And Benny Johnson and Dave Rubin didn't know who was funding their content, but they would get paid like an exorbitant amount of money, like $100,000, to make content that Lauren Chen kind of organized. And it turns out it was connected to this Russian media company. So even in the beginning of October 7th, there was some sort of strategic positioning of an anti-Israel conversation on the right. And I think that has moved at an even more, like, rapidly moved forward as the prevailing arguments on the right and in MAGA 2.0, and with comedians like Theo and Dave Smith and Joe Rogan, in a way that, again, doesn't feel organic to me. It's really odd that all of these individuals, like Joe Rogan, who's not like super conservative, I would call him like a free thinker, is also parroting this. And whether that's because he's being lobbied by Qatari interest or because he's just believing people like Tucker Carlson who have huge influence, I can't say. But again, it doesn't feel organic. I don't think that the right and centrist like woke up one day and just realized how horrific the Jews are and how corrupt our government is because of AIPAC. Like, someone is pushing this narrative, and it's for a very strategic agenda. And I would put forth that it's Qatar and other authoritarian interests abroad who have infiltrated our education system. We've seen that happen on the left with our universities and pro-Hamas, pro-Hezbollah campaigns, encampments, anti-Jewish rhetoric, even in the classrooms. And we have proof that Qatar has funded many of our most prestigious institutions and Ivy League schools, which coincidentally is where a lot of these encampments really took place. And no one's talking about it. No one on the new media who's supposed to speak out against government corruption, no one in the established media. And that's because Qatar has their influence in both the legacy and new media platforms. And so it's created, I think, a really dangerous place for America, which is we're being influenced on both sides of the political aisle. This is not just a Republican or a Democrat, woke left or a woke right issue. This is happening on both sides of the political aisle. And so there's pressure from both sides, and it all converges on hating Israel, accusing the Zionists of controlling U.S. interest, and blaming America for the genocide happening in Gaza. And all of those talking points further the interest of Qatar, that funds Hamas, that funds Islamic Jihad, that funds the Muslim Brotherhood, that has a relationship with Iran, and then tries to create an image in the West of being this broker in the Middle East, of condemning extremism, all while funding Al Jazeera, which is its propaganda wing across the Middle East and here in the West. In fact, Al Jazeera has been banned by other Arab nations such as Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt because they're aware of how radical Al Jazeera is and the agenda of the Qatari government. And yet we treat Qatar like they're a legitimate actor in the region and one that should be negotiated with, instead of conditioning our diplomacy with Qatar on no longer funding Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that becomes really difficult to condition when a lot of our own politicians in Washington have been lobbied by Qatar. So it creates a really, really unhealthy echo chamber that leaves Qatar unchecked. All right, so now let's look at the news that broke this last week, and then I have an example of what I'm talking about that we'll look at the end with Theo. Okay. So in the Washington Examiner, which is one of the only other articles I could find, the Free Press did an amazing piece on the Qatar lobby and how Qatar has spent over $100 billion to buy off interest in America. $100 billion. And again, you have the woke right and you have Democrats, you have people on all sides of the political aisle talking about how AIPAC is just like this inherent evil that buys off our politicians to favor Israel and send aid to Israel. But $100 billion is like tenfold all of the money that AIPAC has invested in lobbying their interest with our American representatives. And no one's talking about it. And I'm not making a case for lobbying. I personally don't care for lobbyists. However, that is the democracy that we live in, a capitalist-driven society. But for there to be such outrage over AIPAC and then unchecked criticism of Qatar is absolutely wild. And again, I think that speaks volumes to who is pushing the agenda in the new media and on the woke right. Okay, so this Washington Examiner article also came out, which again, in addition to the free press, is really the only substantive investigative journalism I've seen on this topic. Because again, remember, Qatar has a lot of influence in establishment media. And really for the last 10 years, they've invested a lot in left-leaning media because the Democrats were the mainstream culture. They were also typically in majority power in all three branches of government or two branches of government. And so that's where Qatar put their funding. And now that conservatism and MAGA is mainstream and we have control of the government again, Qatar has now turned and shifted to influence the current political party that is now popular and mainstream. Okay, so this is the article. It goes over, after President Trump's 2024 victory, foreign agents working on behalf of the Qatari government appear to have shifted their focus to right-wing media, again, because now MAGA has moved mainstream. And for the longest time, being a Republican or being a Trump supporter meant that you were part of this counterculture against the woke left agenda, against DEI, against the LGBTQ plus agenda. And now that MAGA is mainstream, there's a lot of dissension and division within MAGA. And now there's also funding coming from Qatar. All right. It says, fueling speculation that the terror-linked Gulf state is attempting to win influence amongst conservatives, which again, I think explains even the rise of the woke right to begin with. I don't think that was an organic rise. I think it's organically grown because you have a huge portion of the MAGA movement that is skeptical of institutions and of governments and of the official government narrative because of COVID. And I think that there's a very healthy level of skepticism. I think, anyone should question our government institutions, especially after COVID. I think that is the only natural byproduct of the pandemic. However, there's an extreme of that happening, and that extreme is being fed by conspiracy theories, again, about the Jews, overall suspicion, almost paranoia for the government that Qatar benefits from. And so Qatar is exploiting that natural suspicion that lies particularly within the MAGA wing of American politics. Okay. It says between January 1st, 2024 and Election Day, just over 10% of communications sent by Qatari foreign agents to the media were directed to conservative outlets or commentators. And again, that was obtained from the Department of Justice because Qatar, unlike what Candace Owens and others claim, lobbies the U.S. government, and they're registered under FARA, which means that those correspondence have to be recorded. There's not a bunch of information on it. We're going to look at some of those documentations in a second, but we do know that there is direct communication between Qatar and establishment and new media outlets here in the United States. Since Republicans won control of the White House and Congress on Election Day, the portion of messages sent by Qatari operatives to conservative outlets and commentators have surged to more than half of their total correspondence with the media. So they've ditched the left. They've ditched the left agenda. And they've moved towards the right, again, which has the same policy objective, which is anti-Israel, but it takes on different language. So they're not going to call Israel colonizers like the woke left would. They'll call Israel corrupt because of the Jewish cabal, because that's more sympathetic to suspicions that Republican conservatives or even Christians might have of Israel. Perhaps Qatar's biggest victory in this post-election right-wing media campaign thus far was securing an interview between Tucker Carlson and Qatari Prime Minister in March. The interview, which has racked up over 6 million views on X and YouTube, was friendly, with Carlson praising the country. And I've talked about that interview here on this channel. It's like a very softball interview. It looks a lot like when he went to Russia and interviewed Putin. Like, no hard-hitting question. Not once did he ask about Qatar funding Hamas. Not once did he ask about Qatar funding the Muslim Brotherhood. And he asked really softball questions like, is Iran actually that bad? Framing Iran as like Iraq and the Iraq war and how neocons in the United States want to embark on a war with Iran in a very similar way for similar objectives, without asking Qatar at all about their ties with Iran, their joint interests, their joint funding of terror organizations in the region. None of that. It was a very softball interview. It was an apologist interview for radical jihad. The article goes on to say, Qatar paid top dollar to ensure this interview took place. Foreign Agents Registration Act records show, FARA, that Lumen 8 Advisors LLC, a legal consulting company for which very little public information is available, so we don't know who's tied to this LLC, helped facilitate between Carlson and the Qatari dignitary. The embassy of the state of Qatar pays Lumen 8 Advisors $180,000 per month to provide media and communication coaching and consulting services. Qatar wants to further cement ties with Trump and allies for many reasons, including to defend itself against Republican attacks for its relationship with Hamas and Iran, which, I think is warranted considering the last year and a half. Anna Jacobs, a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute, said of the Carlson interview. Okay. And so Qatar is wanting to absolve themselves of ties with Iran. And you have people like Theo and Dave Smith talking about just how horrific the war in Israel is, but they don't want to look at who is responsible for it. And the easy scapegoat for that is the Jews, is Israel. And that only furthers the Islamist aims in the region. So from where I sit, anyone puppeting Qatari rhetoric or their policy position on the war is complicit with their vision for jihad in the region. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of those records just so that you guys can see what that looks like. Okay, so this is the records from before Trump won. And what you see is that there's not a significant amount of correspondence with Republican commentators or right-leaning media. A lot of the stuff here you see is NBC News. You see journalists from Foreign Policy, The Wall Street Journal, AP, a lot of left-leaning, CNN. Okay, and there was very few correspondents, but we have some with Amy Kellogg, for example, at Fox News. Someone corresponding with the Washington Free Beacon, the Daily Caller, Fox Opinion, Fox News. So there is influence, right, happening on the right, but not to the extent that it is today. So now post-election 2024, when Trump won in a landslide victory, we now see, let me just pull it up, an increase in communications now with right-wing individuals. So this is the FARA records that we have. And this is activities as of May 15th of this month. We still see them lobbying left-wing, CNN, the Financial Times, Fox News. And then here is, this is like pages and pages and pages long of them corresponding. And then this is the documentation from Tucker Carlson. So you see here, the Lumen 8 Advisors LLC as outlined in the article. The foreign principal name was the Embassy of Qatar. It happened on February 26th of this year. And it was, the point of contact was a Tucker Carlson show. And it was the purpose to interview the Prime Minister of Qatar regarding war with Iran. The Prime Minister of Qatar is being attacked in the media for wanting to stop it. And I wonder why the Qatari Prime Minister wants to stop it. It would almost be like their interests are intrinsically tied to Iran. And that should be a problem. That should be the question Tucker Carlson was asking if he was interested in true journalism, which he doesn't seem to be. All right. So then that brings me to talking about Theo. So Theo is in the Joe Rogan comedian sphere with Dave Smith and the like. But for example, just like Dave Smith, Theo Joe Rogan. These are all comedians who know so little about the region. And this was brought up in the Douglas Murray debate between Murray and Smith, where Smith is talking about aid and checkpoints. And he's talking about it in such a theoretical way that Douglas Murray takes a step back and goes, "What are you even talking about?" And then he asks, "Have you been to the region? Have you seen what is happening?" To have such an authoritative stance on the war and to have such a strong, convicted condemnation of Israel. He goes, "No." And then that erupted into a debate about, you know, education and institutions and being an expert. And I think there's a real push on the right, irrespective of Qatar, which I think is actually the environment in which Qatar is going to flourish on the new media right, which is a rejection of experts, right? Again, harkening back to COVID sentiments, right? The experts got it wrong. Academic institutions have failed our students, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now there's a suspicion of experts. And so when someone with authority like Douglas Smith comes in and goes, or Douglas Murray, I'm sorry, and questions Smith, it's like, oh no, you can't do that. You're an elitist. We reject the experts, right? So now we live in a world where Theo Vaughn is our moral compass when it comes to foreign policy in the Middle East. And don't get me wrong, I really like Theo Vaughn. I think he's hilarious. I followed all of these guys, Joe Rogan as well, before the 2024 election. I was really heartened to see that they interviewed Trump. I think that Theo Vaughn really being the first podcaster in this manosphere space who yields a lot of influence with not just conservative men, but just men in general, and men who I think were really fatigued, even if they were left leaning or centrist or libertarian, with the woke left agenda that was very anti white male in America. And men were over it. And so when Theo Von platformed President Trump, I think it opened the door to President Trump going on Joe Rogan's podcast prior to the election. And I really think that that tipped the scale in Trump's direction for a landslide victory. There's almost like a cultural shift before the election and a momentum that was palpable. And I really think Theo Von and Joe Rogan are to thank for that. And so Theo Von has been kept in Trump's sphere. On his podcast, he has had a few people talk about the war from a Palestinian perspective. He had Candace Owens on to rant about AIPAC, where she peddled again the lie and the ironic lie that Israel is the only country that can lobby the US government and that JFK was assassinated because he wanted AIPAC to register under FARA. Again, FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, essentially just requires sovereign nations who lobby the US to register. It is a monitoring arm of the Justice Department. And it's actually a lot harder to monitor sovereign nations lobbying the US than a super PAC like AIPAC in the United States. There's a lot more monitoring mechanisms for a domestically registered super PAC. As we saw looking even through the FARA documentation, we don't really know who Lumen 8 Group LLC is. The details of that conversation are not extensive. And so there's a lot of anonymity, but also plausible deniability when it comes to foreign governments lobbying US commentators, news outlets, think tanks, government officials, because not everything is on the record. And again, there's a lot more difficulty in monitoring a sovereign nation's interests than a super PAC like AIPAC. Anyways, I digress. So this is a video that Theo Von put out. And I want to note, I have no proof that this was funded by Qatar or that he was directly lobbied fiscally. But what is interesting is he posts this video within the same week he goes to Qatar with President Trump. And the same week he goes to Miami and has dinner with Ivanka Trump and her husband. And just like the timeline of it all, in addition to some of the business dealings with the Trump family in Qatar, and then going to Qatar to see our troops in Qatar, and then having him post this, all seems like a very suspicious timeline. And I'm just connecting the dots. I'm putting this evidence out there for you, and you can decide if it means anything. But I don't think him posting this almost 4-minute video where he says almost absolutely nothing of substance besides condemn the genocide and the US role in the genocide to really achieve much. But I'll let you be the judge of that. We're going to watch the video. It is entitled, "What Have We Become?" It's been on his heart, right? right around the time he's going to Qatar. It's just been wrestling and tugging at his heart. Okay, the war's been happening for a year and a half, and there's still Palestinians living in Gaza, and Hamas has even come out and said that the reported numbers are completely false. Again, what a lot of people have been talking about is the line between civilian and combatant in Gaza is very thin, and also the fact that adolescent deaths include anyone under the age of 18, but we know that child soldiers within Hamas are also very prevalent. Anyways, I digress, but it's hard to take him seriously when he's talking about how he feels that there's a genocide happening in real time. And when you watch the rest of this video, you get the sense that he knows almost very little about what he's talking about. And again, I don't know his heart. I'm not the Lord. Maybe his heart really burns for the Palestinian children of Gaza. But just like Dave Smith and Joe Rogan and Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, there's absolutely no recognition of the elephant in the room, of the perpetrator of this entire conflict, which is Hamas. And I just have to continue to ask the question, why is that? And why hasn't anyone questioned it? It's almost like, again, they're following an official narrative. And just like the legacy media on the left has peddled an official narrative about racism in America, about LGBTQ plus rights, about, divesting as a white man from your privilege, like this prevailing social justice narrative and this anti-Israel narrative from that perspective is very cohesive. Very few left-leaning commentators step out of line with the talking points that have been pushed down our throats for the last 10 years. And now we're seeing that emerge again on the right. Like there's a cohesion to it. There are talking points. And I know I'm repeating myself, but I really want the audience to understand that someone is orchestrating that. Now, whether they're orchestrating that with all of these influencers directly, or that a lot of these influencers are then influenced by the Tucker Carlsons in the space, I don't know. But again, it's very odd. It's not organic. There's like no dissension. There's no intellectual honesty. There's no inquisition. Like there's no questions being asked about Hamas. Nothing. It's like, you're going to listen to the rest of this video. He's not going to mention Hamas one time. Those official photos look like Al Jazeera photos. Like this is straight propaganda. And like the narrative that he's pushing, again, is part of this whole pro-Palestine Hamas apology wing of the Qatari government, really pushed by Al Jazeera, and then also peddled with independent influencers. It doesn't matter because the Jews are this evil cabal corrupting the US government. That's what all of these statements underlying, that's what that means, or what other people will insinuate. But again, it's this very overarching talking point. And the other thing he mentions is that it's the US's fault. And that's another prevailing argument we've seen. And like I mentioned at the top of the episode with Tucker Carlson questioning the West and the United States and World War II, like, were we really the good actors of that conflict? And it's this additional agenda of demonizing America. Again, that doesn't sound like what a true red-blooded American would say. It sounds like what our enemies abroad, such as Qatar, would say about America. And there's this other very common thread throughout all of these videos is um, elevating the war in Gaza as like the greatest evil of history and of our time. And Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Dave Smith, again, like the normal crew of people on the right will talk about this conflict like it is an outlier of human history, like it is the greatest evil to ever exist. The Holocaust, that wasn't a special evil, but what's happening in Gaza is like a horrific and unique evil. When in reality, war sucks. Like war is hard to digest. Civilians die. It is horrendous. But this is a war that started because of what happened on October 7th, which was a well-documented assault on Israel, by the way, from the POV footage that Hamas militants wore and of the video footage we have from Palestinian civilians coming in after the militants and looting Israeli homes and taking hostages as well. Like the Bibas family, for example, was taken not by Hamas militants, but by Palestinian civilians. So enough of trying to pretend that Israel is just the greatest evil and that, you know, this war just started out of nowhere because Israel is just genocidal. If Israel was genocidal, they would have wiped Gaza off the map on October 8th. The conservative party, like true conservatives, need to take a step back and wonder why, again, there is such cohesion in these talking points that it seems to favor our enemies' perspective and rhetoric from abroad, and ask, why is that? Again, if you're a conservative, Republican, MAGA voter, you saw how the establishment media and their interest were peddled in lockstep, in harmony for the last 10 years. So when you start to see that emerge on the right and with new media, don't write that off. I think that people are more susceptible to what the Tucker Carlsons and the Theo Vons have to say because they represent this new media space. And intrinsically to it not being tied to a bigger media network is the assumption that Theo Von and Tucker Carlson represent their own ideas and their own interest. But they're being orchestrated and told what to say in a very similar way to what the establishment media was told for decades. And just like Qatar shifted their influence to Republican influencers and commentators and news outlets after Trump won, they're also shifting their attention and their money towards the influencers in this new media space. And so just because new media might imply or evoke ideas of being anti-establishment or representing the influencer's own individual interest, just know that they can be bought off in the exact same way that the legacy media has been bought off for decades. And at some point, the counter-revolution, you know, the anti-woke left agenda that is the MAGA movement, or that many in the MAGA movement represent, at some point move mainstream. And then they become the establishment. Like at some point, the new media space and YouTube and independent influencers will become the establishment media that they were rebelling against in 2020. That is the cycle of history. That is how cultures shift and movements change. And just like Tucker Carlson started his podcast and his network as anti-elitism, anti-establishment, he is now forming a new media establishment. Stay awake, not woke. Don't be woke right or woke left. And just critically assess what all of these influencers are saying. And you might see the through lines and the influence once you start to tune in to what they have to say. All right, with that, I'm going to leave you. If you like this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe to the Fearless Project channel. And you can follow me on X at Dom R. Hoff, and I will link everything in the description box down below. I'll see you in the next episode.